Okay, Amir? Now. All right, yeah, unusual start of 10 past, not quarter past. Welcome everybody. This is wonderful to see you back after the holidays because if you haven't been with us before, this is part of a mega series called the 20 Leading Distinguished Female Scholars in the World. It's called the Athena series. And I'm proud to say this is the only series in the world which has only females featured in 20 in a row. I think there was some kind of a TEDx that stole our idea recently, so we will sue them soon. Our lawyers are working as we speak. So this is number 15, I think, Marta, and we're very happy to get into the field of heritage. Finally, we have been dwelling in political, urban politics, urban planning and design, landscape architecture, and other fields. But now we are back to we are entering heritage. And I'm very happy to introduce today our speaker. Maybe this is the first time in Sweden, right? Or no, last year, wrong info. But first time at KTH. First time in Stockholm in KTH. Emma Waterton, which will present. And what I do here, my name is Tigran Haas, because I see a lot of new faces, so I should say that. I'm the director of the Center for the Future of Places, which is the host for this series, and it's also the host is the School of Architecture and the Built Environment, or the Division of Urban and Regional Studies. So what I usually do every time when we have a speaker, I make a collage. And there's a lot of part of the collage is also different presentations and faces of, but there were so many books that I found that Emma wrote that there was no space to put Emma as a figure inside. But really, that's one of the strengths of our speaker today. Many anthologies and many books written within heritage culture and representation. And over 70 articles. But Emma is associate professor in the geographies of heritage. That's a very elegant title, because we also have a colleague of mine who's a professor in heritage management. But that means, cultural heritage, urban geography brought together. At Western Sydney University, she was Research Council's UK Academic Fellow at Keele University for 4 years until 2010, and a DECRA Fellow. And the interesting reputation that she has in Australia is based, and I will read these three sustained contributions to the field of heritage. One is the idea of heritage as discourse, a re-theorization of heritage in terms of emotion and effect, and finally, and before that, engaging with innovative and experimental research methods, and finally exploring the intersection between heritage and practices of social governance. So all of these very intricate fields of study are brought in these anthologies that Emma has been part of. She has authored 3 monographs: Politics, Policy, and the Discourse of Heritage in Britain by Palgrave, Heritage Communities and Archaeology, co-authored Laurie Jane Smith, right, 2009, and The Semiotics of Heritage Tourism with Steve Watson, late Steve Watson, 2014. 7 international peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, and I guess a new book that you're working now, which is titled, is it Critical Studies in Heritage and Emotion Effect? It's a book series, yeah. So a lot of stuff. In an elegant field it is. We are architects who always look towards human geography and heritage. Such elegance and softness. So, okay, there's hard issues too. So, without any overdue, I will give the word to Emma, and then after that we'll have a interesting discussion. Oh, I just need to warn you that you are being filmed. So this is what is it, Marta? GDPR, right? Sounds like the Honecker DDR system. Whoever has felt that knows what that was. So if you're not comfortable with this, we can erase your face later on, or put a blurb, or we can just let you be, participant in this event. So, Emma, welcome.
I think I'm on now, I think. So I just want to start by first saying thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I also had the pleasure this morning of talking to some of the excellent postgraduate students here who are doing their master's degrees through the Centre for Future Places, and I had a wonderful morning with everyone fielding some questions about academic publishing. So thank you very much for the invitation to come. Actually, it's been a very nice and welcome break from the sizzling Sydney summer that we've come from, where we had 40 degrees Celsius temperatures when we left, to I think we landed at 0, so we lost 40 degrees in a day, so that was great. I need to do some quick maneuvering here. Okay, I have a script. I'm not a very gifted off-the-cuff speaker, so forgive me for that. I have a script which I will try very hard not to race through. So if I'm going fast, just give me a nod and I'll slow down. I'm starting with a series of vignettes to kind of give you an impression of how I got to where I am with the research I'm doing at the moment. Is there anyone, asks Teresa Brennan, who has not at least once walked into a room and felt the atmosphere? Is there anyone who has not felt it pressing in, weighing heavy? For me, the clearest memory of experiencing such a density of feeling occurred in September 1999 when I visited the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. Part of that museum houses the relocated remains of a small section of wall and 2 adjoining stone steps. Both the wall and steps are marked with visible reminders of heat and trauma. But impressed into their fabric, there is something else: a smudge, a smear, a shadow. It's all that is left of a man who was sitting on those steps, waiting for the Sumitomo Bank to open at the precise moment that an atomic bomb was dropped on the city. I remember it taking me a few heartbeats to recognize and register what I was seeing, to really understand. I remember, too, feeling things in ways I hesitate to put into words today. But I've carried that atmosphere with me ever since. It has a lived duration that continues to haunt. Those feelings came back with a vengeance in 2006 when I visited Auschwitz. I was standing in Block 5, frozen in front of a display of cases filled with battered old shoes, suitcases, spectacles, and prosthetic limbs. Frozen on the outside, that is. On the inside, I was being pummeled by a thick wave of sensations. On that visit, the frigid weather, the naked trees, and an absence of wildlife seemed to work together with Block 5 to get under my skin, gathering and assembling a silent heaviness that induced a sadness, one that ached often too much. This was an ache that both enveloped and permeated. It circled around and in me, and I could sense it radiating from one visitor to the next. I started to search for those feelings as a researcher in 2012 when I visited Pearl Harbor. I was there in July, having tasked myself with interviewing people visiting the Pearl Harbor Memorial Complex over the course of a fortnight. On the first morning of my visit, I arrived on site at 7:30 a.m. when the air was still fresh and dewy. A handful of cars were dotted around the car park, and a small group of visitors loitered at the memorial's entrance. Clutching my ticket for the 8 a.m. USS Arizona Memorial Tour, I moved into the site, watchful and a little apprehensive. After a short wait, I was ushered into the Pearl Harbor Memorial Theater to view a National Park Service film that would introduce the surprise Japanese attack on the US Pacific Fleet at their moorings in 1941. From there, I was quietly herded onto a small US Navy-operated shuttle boat and taken out to the memorial. I remember vividly the sound of water lapping against its concrete footings as we approached, and I can easily recall the stark white memorial itself, hovering over a wreckage that held together all that was left of the lives of over 1,000 crewmen. The water's surface shimmered with that flighty rainbow slick of oil still leaking from the ship below. With the introductory film still fresh in my mind, I could just about make out the dark outlines of 183 fighters on torpedo bombers filling the sky, followed by strafing, shooting, fire, and panic. 185 vessels of the US Navy were moored at Pearl Harbor, on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, including 8 battleships clustered together in an area that has since become known as Battleship Row. 3 of those battleships never returned to service. The Oklahoma was capsized, the Utah sank, and the Arizona exploded, sinking in just 9 minutes. Time always shifts when I remember those moments because that world is no longer there. And when I do remember them, their emotional and affective capacities move unbidden across my body. What is it about heritage that makes people feel things? Hiroshima, Auschwitz, Pearl Harbor. And isn't it funny how the weather and atmosphere affects things, I thought, as I stood beside a field in North Yorkshire, on the verge of a country road a year later in 2013. I was interested in what lay beside the lane, an average-looking agricultural field in the corner of which stood an old cross, a monument to battle. On some days, the base of the cross is adorned with a small cluster of poppies, or larger sprays of white poppies, the symbol of Yorkshire, left as a mark of respect. At other times, little wooden crosses can be found, the same as those used on Armistice Day, and which, like the poppies, are associated with the more recent conflicts as a sign of remembrance. One of those crosses once bore the following words, carefully written in biro. To the Yorkist army who fell here Palm Sunday, 1461, from a loyal Yorkshireman. On such occasions, the cross seems larger, as if amplified by significance and intensity. And yet, just as often, it appears to recede, an inconspicuous and nondescript stone cross tucked forlornly behind a hedgerow at the side of a quiet road. Of course, the relationship between heritage, emotion, and affect need not be limited to battlefields and sites of trauma. Later in 2013, I had the good fortune of pursuing research in Kakadu National Park in the top end of Australia. During that period of fieldwork, I can recall few things more startling than seeing a two-masted sailing ship sketched onto the surface of a rock shelter, towing a small dinghy and fitted with a looping anchor chain. The image, which depicts a non-Indigenous watercraft, was sandwiched between extensive collections of traditional Aboriginal X-ray art that catalogued fish and other animals with their internal organs displayed. The juxtaposition was surprising and mesmerizing. Standing in that shelter, confronted by clear references to a process of cross-cultural exchange that would have irrevocable consequences for Aboriginal Australians, I was brought into relation with the body of an artist who years earlier had carefully sketched the details of that ship out of white pipe clay. I find myself simultaneously in two places, or rather the same place in two different times, trying to imagine the bewilderment and violence of colonial contact. My analysis of tourists' engagements with heritage sites in that park was momentarily halted as I gazed at the careful reproduction and tried to visualize a past I was grateful I had not been forced to experience. A short time later, in 2014, I entered the grounds of Sovereign Hill, an open-air museum devoted to Australia's gold rush, on a hot autumn morning, again for research. Emerging into the spaces of that outdoor museum was like letting a secret out of a bag. The streetscape exploded with colour and fuss, quaintness and quirkiness. My response was a physiological one, produced by a welter of sounds, smells, images, and impressions. Within the museum, people and objects seemed to settle into scenes of life, scenes that stood as traces of a past still resonant in things. And memories were let loose in those glossy encounters. During my visit, such memories were carried on the delicious scent of freshly baked lamb stew pies and mixed into the sharp sounds of horse-drawn carriages clattering by. Things and sounds and smells flashed up at Sovereign Hill all the time. It vibrated with the effort. Dulled by comparison were references to the rough textures of human labour and the harshness of everyday gold mining life. Though there were hints of both leaking out into the diggers' tents and the Chinese camp, there was no weight. No weight was given to the nameless workers and their lives, to the people who might have done other things and had other lives beyond that mine. Neither in 1999, when I had just finished my undergraduate degree, nor in 2006, when I was halfway through my doctoral research, did I have the vocabulary to name what I was experiencing. I had learnt to use the term heritage during my master's in 2004. But it was only more recently, perhaps in the last 5 years, that I've come to understand heritage using more than representational thinking and theories of effect. And this will be the focus of my presentation today. At first sight, it might seem a little out of step to present a paper on heritage, on the past, in a lecture series hosted by the Centre for Future Places. I should start then by indicating that I take heritage to mean those places, objects, and memories that have acquired shared meanings, beliefs, and values, to the extent that people alter their behaviour in relation to them in the present. I expect in this regard the topic gels quite well with one of the Centre's research themes, urban form and human behaviour, with heritage and the past providing a context against which we can evaluate human responses. After all, heritage is the repository of much of what we have come to feel about ourselves in the present, as individuals and as collectivities. Given this definition, one would imagine that the past is replete with affective resonances that are ripe for academic investigation. Yet curiously, heritage studies as a field has been slow to grasp the opportunities posed by theories of effect. Its strong canon of representational literature, developing since the 1980s, has tended to emphasize the textual and visual in relation to national and cultural identities, authorized or official versions of the past, ideologies, and placemaking. In addition, heritage research practice has had the tendency of being dominated by operational needs and positivist empiricism. The turn to effect, therefore, poses significant challenges. My purpose in this presentation is not to dispense with any particular methodology or technique. Instead, I want to use the presentation to rethink forms of empiricism that guide our collection of data and knowledge, and turn to those that are lively and persistent and provide some methodological purchase on affectivity. It furthers a task I commenced with the late Professor Steve Watson, who sadly passed away in 2016. It's part of our quest to set existing approaches in motion alongside less conventional methodologies and techniques to create a more open and less paradigmatic empiricism in our field. This new empirical motility provides opportunities and a potential not only for broadening the range of methods employed in heritage research, but also for expanding the scope of the field itself, to understand its affective and emotional consequences, and to learn how to ask different questions. It was these consequences that exercised a great deal of shared thinking between Steve and I. How to identify, capture, and evaluate registers that are by their very nature elusive, sometimes only detectable through representations, and those representations that we are trying to see beyond and through. The questions that remain unanswered, we thought, are essentially those concerned with the body and the senses, and the way that we as sensuous bodies experience the world. With these aspects foregrounded, we immediately engage the self as embodied and operant with its full range of senses. So whilst we can ask people who they are, what they're doing, and consult their attitudes, values, and beliefs, how they feel about the things they encounter, and how this intersects with their behavior, the physical setting, and what they have brought into it, either alone or with others, has often sat beyond conventional research. And so I, along with others in the field, have become concerned with affect as a constellation of meaning around embodied states that challenges cognition and representation. This is not to suggest that cognition and representation have no place in this discussion, because I believe they do. Rather, I suggest that our understanding of their relationship with the body and its capacities is unsettled and problematic. And while I'm keen not to confuse affect with feeling and emotion, to adhere to a focus that isolates them from each other seems counterproductive. It also sails close to what we might call the empirical problem of affect, which is to say that it is very difficult to capture methodologically. And if we did, where would it take us beyond an awareness that precognitive registers exist? What questions would it imply? That an encounter with heritage stimulates this or that response, or that another encounter provides more or less stimulation? Maybe. But what we really are concerned with is the context of affect in the body and its capacities to be affected and to affect others. At the same time, We're also concerned not only with individual encounters with heritage, but with shared ones, with groups, communities, social classes, and societies. No exploration of heritage, emotion, and affect can close off the social, the shared, and the political that makes heritage a significant cultural form. Yet only taking on board the established view that it is a socio-cultural construct that expresses identity and power would be catastrophic in any attempt to ever fully understand it. But I still need to be clear about what we are looking for. What are the key factors in engagements with heritage, and how do they register effectively as feelings, as emotions, and cognitively? This is my current project, to identify those categories of heritage experience that can be mapped across feelings, emotions, affect, and cognition, and the relationships between them. Some are familiar, some less so. Identity, affiliation, memory, conflict, horror, fear, boredom, and pleasure all figure in discussions of the way heritage affects people. But what also of interest and fascination? These are the aspects of heritage that get people out on Sunday afternoons and link the cognitive with the affective and emotional registers of enjoyment and recreation. I cannot explore all of this here. It is a bigger agenda that I've been exploring elsewhere. But what I can do is discuss a couple of particular projects and report on the progress I've made so far. Using 2 case studies, I will articulate a style of research that addresses, I hope, the intensity of affective, emotional, and cognitive registers, and attempts to capture the essence of encounters at 2 places of heritage, one in England, one in Australia, and both introduced earlier. The first is Taunton Battlefield, which draws on research I did with Steve Watson, and the second is Sovereign Hill. In the presentation, I'll use the term semiotic landscape to capture the theoretical terrain. It's a term I developed with Steve in 2014 to argue for the broadening of the parameters of semiotic analysis to include more than representational theorizations. While interested in language, discourse, visuality, representation, and signification, are all those things generally assumed to sit within the remit of semiosis, or the production of meaning, we were also inclined towards expanding the semiotic to include immediacy, performance, engagement, feelings, and emotion. In using the term semiotic landscape then, I'm attempting to point to the interweaving of thought, habits, discourse, affect, and emotion, and thus bring together the analysis of both semiosis and affect within the field of heritage tourism. Initially borrowing from an intervention commenced by Nigel Thrift and his term non-representational theory, I've adopted the more broadly defined more than representational style of thinking here, or as well as, in an attempt to halt what Margaret Wetherall has called that slippage of affect into becoming something kind of other to semiosis. At essence, a more than representational approach advocates for the inclusion of the everyday, relational, and affective, while simultaneously offering an acknowledgement of the pre-discursive and pre-cognitive. Investment in a more than representational approach brings with it a rethinking of emotional encounters and an attentiveness to the concept of affect, which Ben Anderson has defined as a transpersonal capacity which a body has to be affected through affection and to affect as the result of modifications. Authoritative precedents for this sort of thinking are located in the philosophical works of Deleuze, Guattari, Spinoza. However, in this presentation, I want to skim the surface rather than delve too deeply into that architecture of thinking. This is because I simply want to point to the actions and reactions produced in response to engagements and proximities, or atmospheres, performances, ritual, gestures, movements, and emergent experiences. I also want to avoid, as I mentioned earlier, the hard distinctions often implied between semiosis and affect, as well as emotion and affect, and recognize instead that the concepts all work together to produce meaning in ways that are often very clear and very productive. In taking up an interest in the more than representational, I want to push the debate in heritage studies towards unpacking not only what heritage places, interpretations, and experiences might mean, but what they might do. This inclusion of the immediacy of experience allows for a more fulsome understanding of what happens when people sensually engage heritage through proximity. The concept of contagion is useful here, as it prompts researchers to think not only about individuals, but also about social accounts, signification, narratives, and responses, or the subjective experiences of a body in relation to other bodies passing through the same spaces of heritage. Ahmed's reflections on emotional work are particularly instructive here. Indeed, she sees emotions in effect not as something that specifically and only reside in an individual or object, but as things that circulate among and between them, sticking to one or other as they ripple and slide sideways or backwards in time, leaving traces in the present. She sums this position up most clearly in the opening paragraphs of her 2004 article, Affective Economies, in which she writes, "How do emotions work to align some subjects with others and against others? How do emotions move between bodies? In this essay, I argue that emotions play a crucial role in the surfacing of individual and collective bodies through the way in which emotions circulate between bodies and signs. Such an argument clearly challenges any assumption that emotions are a private matter, that they simply belong to individuals, or even that they come from within and then move outwards towards others. It suggests that emotions are not simply within or without, but that they create the very effect of the surfaces or boundaries of bodies and worlds." Dennis Byrne, a scholar who locates himself in heritage studies, has also recently attempted to understand the role played by objects in place, or things in space, in the transmission of effect. Although in his analysis, Dennis is working with a very contemporary past, or not so old things in his words, his interest in the way that objects and environments are vivified by their involvement in the drama of our lives rings true in the two case studies I want to focus on today, despite their deeper temporality. In his reflections, Dennis refers to Sarah Ahmed and her notion of stickiness, which he uses to understand how certain objects from the past, contemporary or otherwise, become charged with effects by their associations with significant events. Like Ahmed, Dennis sees emotions and effects as things that circulate among and between individuals, objects, and places, sticking to one another and leaving traces in the present. The turn to effect thus opens up questions about what a heritage object or place means, what feelings it evokes, and which emotions stick to it over time as people interact with it. Places of heritage, of course, work differently on different visitors. The capacity to stick to people and their memories and pull them into orbit depends on the effective power of the residues of the past that are found there and how they are encountered. All these insights serve as a useful prompt for thinking more clearly about the relationship between heritage tourism and everyday life. Consider any heritage tourism object or place, for example. It is usually immediately possible to detect some of the contours of intensity that design that place and its meanings, from the totality of objects, spaces, and times that we encounter and inhabit in our daily lives. Indeed, we already have an empirical cartography of such meanings for most heritage destinations. We find them in guidebooks, on tourist maps that point to intensities signified as tourist attractions. Attending to a more than representational approach, however, gives insight into such places beyond their role as attractions by bringing to bear embodied meaning-making or embodied semiosis. In other words, the semiotic landscape of heritage tourism allows for a focus on discursive and affective entanglements. Acknowledging the latter opens up the possibility of questioning what an attraction means and what feelings it evokes, and which emotions, as I said earlier, stick to it over time as people interact with it. Such an approach also enables us as researchers to think about heritage objects and spaces that attract other sorts of feelings or intensities that are not touristic in nature, but are sponsored by some other sort of interest, bodily memory, or history of contact. So that's the sort of theoretical terrain, which I'll be drawing on as I detail some of the places where I've tried to use this to think through what is happening at particular tourist sites. Start with the Waterton battlefield in the UK, in England. As you are probably aware, England is covered with battlefields, with the last pitched battle taking place there in Sedgemoor in 1685. Conveniently, and more or less since its establishment in 1791, the Ordnance Survey, the agency responsible for mapping the country, has recorded these sites on maps, nowadays with little cross-sword symbols accompanied by the date of the battle. For much of its existence, nothing else marked the site of the Battle of Taunton, which took place near York in 1461, until in 1929, the local council erected its slim memorial cross, to which reference has already been made. The battle itself occurred during the so-called War of the Roses, which took place over a 30-year period between 1455 and 1485. The Battle of Taunton features in Shakespeare's Henry VI, in which, to illustrate the evils of civil war, the king is seen watching a father grieve after killing his own son, and a son grieving over the killing of his father. An engraving of the battle was subsequently published in Hanmer's 1744 edition of the play. Apart from these occurrences, Taunton features very little in public consciousness or public history, aside from one particular aspect that has echoed down through the centuries and lingers in the landscape. It is held by tradition to be the largest battle ever fought on English soil, in terms of the number of casualties. The figures are contested and the sources unreliable, but it has entered popular discourse that some 28,000 people were killed there. The high number of casualties is largely seen as the consequence of a deadly arrow storm launched into the Lancastrian forces by Yorkist archers from the direction of a blizzard, and also because the battle turned into a rout in which many soldiers were run down and slaughtered as they fled the field. Little else about the wars has pierced the popular imagination, and certainly not its precise historical detail. Perhaps this is because the politics were complex and involved so many characters and factions, though it revolved mainly around the dynastic machinations of King Henry VI, the Duke of York, and King Henry IV. While it is unnecessary to discuss the historical background in detail here, a short summary might help to provide the context. King Henry VI, a Lancastrian, forced his rival, the Duke of York, into exile in France. Shortly thereafter, however, the Duke's ally, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, invaded England from France and managed to capture and imprison Henry in the process. Stay with me if you can. This allowed the Duke of York to return to England, though he was dissuaded from immediately claiming the throne. Instead, the Lancastrians, who confusingly were based in York at the time, marched south to do battle with the Duke of York, who equally confusingly was then based in London. They met at Wakefield, where York and his second son were killed. His eldest son, the Earl of March, was duly crowned King Edward IV. Meanwhile, King Henry had been released from captivity by the Lancastrian forces and was now on the loose. Edward gathered the Yorkist forces and marched north, inflicting a crushing victory over the Lancastrians during the Battle of Taunton on Palm Sunday, 1461. The overall strategic significance of the battle, however, was not immediately apparent, and the conflict rumbled on for another 20 years. Eventually, however, the Lancastrians would claim victory through Henry Tudor, both with his defeat of Richard III and his marriage to Henry IV's daughter, Elizabeth of York. So a confusing story. Why interest in this battle began to emerge recently is difficult to work out. One possibility is that with the farming methods of the late 20th century, including deeper ploughing, more of the material remains of the battle, coins, arrowheads, human remains, began to be unearthed. The latter often showing signs of severe trauma, all of which tend to capture the public imagination. That's the field today. It is more likely, however, that an interest in Taunton reflects the growing significance and sense of place to which reference has been made frequently in recent literature. This in turn is seen as a reaction to the uniformities of globalization and the paradox whereby individual places are invested or reinvested with value, not least through whichever cultural capital can be mustered and employed to create local distinctiveness. Thus, bizarre local straws are grasped at, as Lucy Lippard has put it, to add some value to places that might otherwise be devoid of anything that would mark them out as significant in the great global scheme of things. Over the last 10 years then, Taunton, a place devoid of very much meaning or significance in terms of national history, has become something. A place of commemoration, a place to visit, a place where affect and emotion are mobilized by representations of an event that took place 5.5 centuries ago. As someone who was born in North Yorkshire and lived there while doing my master's and PhD at the University of York, I've always been aware of Taunton. But the stone cross erected in the 1920s was the only monument to battle. With the site fenced off and farmed for many generations, it held on to its secrets. In the last few years, however, it has begun to arouse local interest and spark their curiosity. It began in the 1990s when Taunton Hall was extended. During the alterations, a mass grave was discovered in the garden and excavated by the University of Bradford. The skeletons of some 40 individuals were found, many of whom showed evidence of extreme violence. Local and media interest focused attention on the site in a way that had never existed before, and the Taunton Battlefield Society was established to help preserve the site and create opportunities for education and research. Television documentaries soon followed, along with a number of what Steve and I have referred to as core representations that portrayed the site to its audience. These core representations are a combination of historical facts, images, texts, and beliefs about the battle and the site that have become part of Taunton's semiotic landscape and might be listed as follows. It allegedly had the highest casualty rate of any battle on English soil, with some 28,000 dead, although this is not substantiated historically, and there are variations with some claiming 50,000. The battle took place in a ferocious blizzard. The Lancastrians, blinded by the snow from that blizzard, suffered huge losses because they just simply didn't see the arrows coming through the blizzard. They turned and fled, but the Yorkists chased them and butchered them as they overtook them on the field. A nearby stream was bridged by dead bodies and ran with blood. It's now referred to as the Bridge of Bodies. And gruesome wounds can be seen on the skeletons recovered from the site. These are the sort of core representations. This received knowledge, a combination of myth, supposition, colourful popular history, and documented fact, has now been supplemented by archaeological information, much of which relates to the human remains that often bear highly visible signs of trauma associated with specific medieval weaponry. This in turn has become central to the ways in which the battle is represented in text, television documentaries, news reports, and so forth. From there, this core material has been used in the interpretive media for a battlefield trail that is now the primary means for physical and educational access to the site. In other words, the kinds of representations listed above had now become part of the site itself through interpretation boards. In becoming something, Taunton became the focus of a great deal of representational activity. But there was something else at play too, some other register that lay beneath or beyond the cognitive, an intensity that seemed to be related to beliefs about the number of casualties and the horrific nature of their deaths. These were feelings that circulated around the representational core of the site, and though influenced by it, were registered separately to or in addition to it. The question then became how to find a style of research that would address these registers, their motilities, and their capacities in people to be affected in this way. We thus adopted 3 sets of activities: an immersive engagement with a key event in 2012, correspondence with members of the Battlefield Society, and walk-through or go-alongs, recorded commentaries with people visiting the site. At the annual Palm Sunday commemoration event in 2012, we mingled with crowds, struck up conversations, took photographs, and joined a small guided tour as it moved along the battlefield trail. We took note of the activities and interactions unfolding around us and tried to sense the atmosphere, focusing upon how welcome we felt and the ways in which we were able to participate. Later, we made detailed notes of our experiences, perceptions, and feelings and compared them. We were surprised by the richness of these, laced as they were with a heightened self-awareness and sensitivity. Our second style of research style took the form of what we have called the provocation, which was directed at active members of the society. Whereas conventionally we would have interviewed them, we now, in the spirit of our new research style, told them what we thought and felt about the battlefield in a list of 15 statements or prompts that expressed a thought or a feeling that we had about the site. We secured collaboration in the project by writing to each member to ask if they would be willing to be provoked, explaining that they would be sent a list of statements and prompts to which they were invited to add something, additional thoughts in agreement or dissent, an image, a verse, or anything else that they felt was appropriate, and as much or as little as they pleased. Our third and final research style was applied to people visiting the site, whom we either accompanied as they walked around the battlefield as a go-along, or asked to record their thoughts as they walked around on their own, the walkthrough. Either way, they were given a small digital recorder to collect their thoughts and immediate responses. No instructions were given, other than to say that we were interested in their thoughts and feelings. Again, no indication was given as to how much or how little to say. Rather, it was up to them, and by this means, they owned the research activity, and the recordings were later transcribed for analysis. The site of the battlefield is relatively remote by English standards, and we soon discovered that selecting collaborators by chance encounter tended to result in a wasted journey. We decided, therefore, to invite people and take them to the site. We had no particular sampling criteria in mind, and given the time needed to reach the site, these would be people who were sufficiently interested or motivated to make the journey and spend some time there. The willingness of our collaborators to be involved in the research impressed us from the outset. Likewise did the richness of the responses we received from both society members and visitors alike. The provocation yielded all manner of contributions that were richly expressive of the way that people felt about the site, including poetry, images, and even directions to websites and YouTube videos, as well as prose. This was very different from the results we might expect from a traditional survey or in-depth interview. The same applies to the visitors. From the perfunctory to the loquacious, their contributions brought out a depth of feeling and a subtlety that we suspect might have eluded conventional research methods. We were surprised, for example, by the willingness of people to take on the affective registers of the place and connect with them. Sometimes they used something from their own memory and experience, such as a military service or religious belief. Sometimes it was a simple recognition of the affective intensity that was now literally in place. One visitor might even have read some theory before she answered, "It's affecting. It brings you inside the moment of their pain and their fear." Others remarked, "It certainly affects me. I've seen people on guided walks reduced to tears, me and my husband included." Actually, I find it a place of great calmness, as though the violence of the past has been softened by the passing of the years. Feelings of empathy with the common soldier, as opposed to the nobles who literally owned them, was also common. There was also a clear articulation of the role played by atmosphere, particularly if the weather conditions were adverse, prompting visitors to connect with the conditions at the time of the battle. It's as if they were using the weather as a vector into the affective atmosphere that is now part of the place. These concerns with atmosphere were often given visual connections. How the place feels is often closely linked with how it looks, and photographs circulating on social media gave ready substance to these linkages. There was a surprisingly strong theme of identity making attached to this, especially given that the battle took place over 450 years ago and was more or less forgotten for centuries. Discovering Taunton, as one visitor said, and through it reenactment, was like rediscovering a buried race memory, a core of absolute blind Yorkist allegiance which I can't explain. I just know that's what I am. With that came a sense of love and loyalty and some understanding of why people put their lives on the line, not always through compulsion, but also through deeply felt personal allegiance. It also changed my personal identity. in that it's where I met my husband, another dyed-in-the-wool Yorkist, and where we got married. This depth of feeling surprised us. There was nothing nationally significant about Taunton, yet the intensities seemed to flow freely to feelings of loyalty and identity. This reflects the view that affect does not reside in a thing or on the outside waiting to come in. Rather, it is made available on site and easily mobilized, where it moves between people and collectivities, reinforcing feelings of various kinds, including deeply personal affinities and identities. Clearly, there are weaknesses in the research. We were picking up on representations of affect, feelings, and emotion. And that research inevitably was located in the cognitive realm, even when it detects traces of the affective in what people say. Such are our current limitations in this particular area of research. But while at Taunton, we watched and witnessed, mingled with people and photographed them on the battlefield trail. Perhaps the thing that surprised us most was the sheer mobility in space and time of affective emotional capacities and their emergences in moments of encounter. Engagement at the site, in essence, meant registering energies that were generated in 29th of March 1469, and which were reconstituted in the bodies of people visiting there in the present. This idea of an afterlife that lingers in the present drove me to a small town called Ballarat in 2014 and to an open-air museum called Sovereign Hill, which is in the state of Victoria, Australia. Given its remit for storying past lives popularly, I hope to extend the previous case study by homing in on the way heritage sites become their own form of historical geography. With this, I'm referring to the lively, everyday practices of heritage visiting, and in particular, visitors' attempts to understand and respond to contemporary social life within the context of the historical. In other words, how they engage with the past and its uses in the present. To illustrate this argument, I'm going to draw on some data gathered in the form of interviews, go-alongs, which we used at Taunton, and a process of photo elicitation with visitors, which I used to identify emotional, cognitive, and affective responses to the history and heritage of gold mining, which was on display at Sovereign Hill. First, a quick introduction to the site is probably needed. In the summer of 1970, an open reserve located on the outskirts of the regional city was transformed into an open-air museum called Sovereign Hill. Those who agitated for its establishment, the Ballarat Historical Park Association, were motivated by a desire to remember the echoes of an industry no longer present in the area, gold mining. That industry had been replaced some years previously by a newly emerging economic base that had latched itself onto agriculture. But still, gold mining held some promise, both as something to be remembered and as an important driver of a different kind of economy, tourism. Keen to acknowledge that Ballarat had been founded on rich deposits of gold and an associated glorious past, the association resolved that the city's leading role in the great Australian gold rushes would never be forgotten. And so, with the opening of the Sovereign Hill Outdoor Museum on the 29th of November 1970, the Victorian goldfields, which commenced operation over a century earlier in the 1850s, were calcified and spatially fixed into the small corner of the landscape, where they continue to be remembered as a short-lived but incredibly influential industry. Since its establishment, Sovereign Hill has become an emblematic example of Australia's heritage. Indeed, as Frost points out, no other heritage attraction in Australia operates on its scale. In terms of appeal, Sovereign Hill entices not only those wishing to honour the region's gold mining past, but those interested in the labour movement and Australia's history more broadly. As such, it trades on strong themes of nostalgia and is packed with artefacts, streetscapes, costumed actors, stories, reconstructions, and performances that attempt to recover and represent the experiences of the goldfields. It is also attentive to themes of nationalism, particularly in its attempt to relay narratives relating to the early settlement of Australia. Of central importance in this regard is the museum's association with the Eureka Rebellion of 1854, which is commonly remembered as an historic uprising mobilised against British colonial authority, and in some pockets of the nation's collective memory as the birthplace of Australian democracy. Given these claims to such a prominent moment in Australia's history, it is unsurprising that Sovereign Hill has welcomed thousands of visitors year on year since first opening its doors. Perched atop a disused quartz mining site to the southeast of the town of Ballarat, Sovereign Hill lies in an area commonly referred to as the Goldfield region. As an outdoor museum, it brings together replica or relocated buildings, streets, mining infrastructures, props and costumed actors, called the Friends of Sovereign Hill, underground mine tours, livestock, and a range of interactive activities for tourist enjoyment. There is also an after-dark extravaganza that showcases the story of the Eureka Rebellion. Overall, it is a highly organised, heavily curated and tightly managed space where history appears given, fixed and timeless. The story of Sovereign Hill begins in 1851, when alluvial gold was found in Ballarat. With the discovery of one of the world's largest gold nuggets in 1858, the Welcome Nugget, pulled from the Red Hill mine and weighing almost 69 kilograms, Ballarat quickly became known as the richest alluvial goldfield ever, and in time would yield over 600 tons of gold. Over the course of a decade, Ballarat hastily and haphazardly transformed into the bustling town needed to cater to the waves of arrivals intent on making their fortune. By the early 1860s, some 40,000 people were working in the area. While aspirations of finding alluvial gold had dwindled by the mid to late 1860s, the quest for gold-bearing quartz continued until 1918 and ended with the First World War. Unlike Towton, it was only a few decades after the closure of the mines that a blueprint for a heritage site was conceived. In the late 1960s, the association commenced planning for a folklore museum that would depict the region of Ballarat during the Gold Rush era. During the planning stages, decisions were made to limit the recreation to the period 1851 to 1861 in order to focus on the best of the gold rush. In its creation, no buildings were constructed or recreated without the use of historical visual references to ensure historical accuracy and the veneer of authenticity. Today, the narrative focus remains predominantly with white European settlers, though numerous references are made to Ballarat's 9,000 Chinese miners. Initially, little reference was made to the Waterton peoples, the traditional owners of the land, although this was addressed in 2015 by the opening of the Hidden Histories exhibition. As a tourist attraction, and very much unlike Towton, Sovereign Hill claims the attention of approximately 600,000 visitors per year, with roughly 28% of that comprised of international visitors. Administered by the Sovereign Hill Museums Association, the popularity of the outdoor museum has turned Ballarat into a key tourist destination in the region. In 2015, it was admitted to the TripAdvisor Hall of Fame, and in the same year, the Labor government committed $8 million for its revitalisation, with the aim of improving the site to attract more visitors, thereby contributing to both the local and state economy. As a museum, Sovereign Hill prides itself on fostering an engaging and interactive interpretive strategy in the creation of living history, for which it draws upon a combination of duplication, reenactment, and activation. As Magelson points out, such museums do not merely represent the past, they make historical truth for the visitor. At Sovereign Hill, this merging of history and performance is achieved primarily through the application of a creative, theatrical, and costumed approach, as the museum's in-house policy makes clear, which I'll just let you read from the screen. This strategy points to the affective and emotional registers that operate in the spaces of heritage, and moreover highlights specific curatorial decisions to foreground emotion, performance, and practice. Key here is an acknowledgement of the role played not only by curators and managers, but by visitors too. In more implicit terms, it references an awareness of historical context and habit, pointing to the fact that many different frames of reference and experience are brought into the museum by each visitor, shaped by specific histories and circumstances. This creates an excessive space with scope for a wide variety of affective, emotional, and cognitive responses, and for visitors to translate and curate their own understanding of the site. In addition then to the material residues of the gold mining past and pervasive discourses of Australia found on site, Sovereign Hill creatively uses museum interpretations and performances to create a powerful semiotic landscape that is encountered by thinking, feeling subjects, many of whom use their visit to interrogate their relationships with the gold mining past and its afterlife. As Gareth Hoskins points out, museums and heritage operations are increasingly employing experiential forms of interpretation, including role adoption and first-person interpretation, in order to cultivate emotional bonds between visitors and the characters that populate historic sites. Today's visitors to Sovereign Hill experience a range of such immersive experiences, all of which occur against a backdrop of musket fire, sweet making, gold pouring, wheel writing, and steam-powered machinery. The site is also alive with sights and smells and sounds, extending from the boiler house, the foundry, the Empire Bowling Saloon, to the scent of candles, freshly made boiled sweets, horse manure dust, and the crunching of feet on unpaved streets. It is also populated by an impressive cast of costumed interpreters. My visit to Sovereign Hill, as I mentioned earlier, took place in March 2014, and I was there for a period of 2 weeks. I spoke with a total of 70 visitors, with conversations varying in length from 5 to 40 minutes, with most audio recorded and later transcribed. We also, I gave people photo cards to take photos and then interviewed them after their visit to talk about what photos they'd taken and what memories and feelings those photos invoked for them. Given my interest in the semiotic landscape of heritage tourism, my intention with these methods was to explore participants' affective discursive entanglements, using their utterances as a point of entry. I encountered a varied collection of people of different ages, genders, ethnicities, religions, occupations, economic classes, and nationalities. Clearly, this collection of people would engage in the semiotic landscape of Sovereign Hill in different ways, feeling, acting, thinking, and curating their own experiential take on the history it represents, creatively, individually, and idiosyncratically. Some responded to the site's discourses of nationhood, others to the interface it provides between the history of Victorian gold rush and a suite of personal memories. Others attuned to its translatability and the critical attention it pushed towards contemporary Australia, while some seemed to connect to immediate sensations or to the way that the bodies of those who might have lived nearby or in similar spaces were imaginatively invited to re-enter the museum space, made present through reenactors. For the remainder of my talk, I just want to talk through 3 of the themes that seem to come out of the data: affective projections of belonging, reinforced nationalism, and critical ruptures of a transnational heritage. Sovereign Hill and the history it represents seems to mean something to a great number of people. Of course, that meaning has different textures and is read by those with different lived experiences. As such, the effective assemblages of the museum, its objects, narratives, scenes, sounds, tentatively move visitors in a variety of ways, and sometimes not at all. Many visitors encountered during the course of my research pointed to a feeling of what I can call emergent nostalgia, prompted in large part by the careful engineering of the non or more than human elements that constitute the outdoor museum. Such visitors nominated the smells, the sounds, and everything else with it, and pointed to the costumed reenactors as those elements that bring the site to life. They were attuned to the distinct fragrances of freshly made pies, to gunpowder, horses, and the lingering smell of burning household fires, all of which had an impact as those smells that had been smelled before and referred to a different, often better time. Katie Bennett's work is instructive here. particularly her notion of belonging through shared nostalgia, through which an unease with the present is placated with reference to a shared and partial history. For some visitors, those elements came together in a relational way, connecting with them and pulling them into place, where they could generate their own associations and tap into or revive previous experiences from childhood or earlier life. These sensations were described as a feeling of stepping back in time and emphasized the mediating role of such elements in the movement between then and now. And there's some quotes here. I'll give you a moment to read. Lots of references to taking people back to a better time. It was the museum's non-discursive eminence or affective valency, to borrow again from Dennis Byrne, that did its work on such visitors, triggering a sense of being transported beyond or behind the time frame of now, and certainly beyond the site's physical preservation. Indeed, what their observations add up to is a sort of affective projection, which taps into a claim made some years ago by, I'm hopeless with names, Lefebvre, who argued no space vanishes utterly, leaving no trace. Likewise, at heritage sites like Sovereign Hill, the past never vanishes entirely. It is a constant intrusion. Such projections, however, were not always about reminiscing about a better time. Various components of the site, which seemed proximate to back then, such as the miners' cottages and descending into the Sovereign quartz mine and its dark, cold, damp corridors, were places in which visitors were pushed to imagine a more difficult time, mostly by the lack of safety and the disorientating effects of little lighting. The absence of both triggered feelings of gratitude for such visitors, who connected their own bodies imaginatively to the harsher lives of others. As one participant puts it, I'll let you read her mind-boggling. A familiar awareness of the madness born of relentless flies and a blanketing dust, and of a context that must have been so uncomfortable in summer and utterly freezing in winter, prompted for some visitors a feeling for what it must have been like for the miners, for the women, and for the Chinese, for a harsh and tenuous life. Such visitors were attuned to the dangers, the loneliness, and the disease, and of the terribly rough work. This peculiar vibrancy, produced by some pockets of the museum, brought forth a clear certainty that Sovereign Hill must exist in multiple times and in multiple places for many different people. Indeed, it was as if the semiotic landscape of the museum was able to poach from a host of memory banks simultaneously, thereby demonstrating the motility and stickiness of affect and its emotional registers, to borrow from Ahmed. This is another quote from a participant. This sense of feeling, registered by many, can be understood as produced by a body in encounter, to borrow from Ness, during which the conditions of here and there, and then and now, were inseparable from each other. So too were the human and non-human elements vitally and integrally connected. Immediately beneath or alongside this momentarily choreographed assemblage sat the possibility of a moment of effect that was not expressible, but which was deeply felt, physical and visceral. As Sarah Ahmed points out, emotions cut across borders and categories of self and difference, and can thus reveal the workings of power and positionality within museological settings. At Sovereign Hill, such landscapes of power seem to emerge around that most registered category of self for those who I spoke with, and that of being Australian, the prevalence of which presumably links to the site's role as defining settler heritage within the nation's repertoire of heritage sites. Examples of such embodied expressions of wider social relations can be seen in the following. sort of sense of Australia, an identity in relation. In part, these are responses to the narratives on display at Sovereign Hill and a palpable pride in its pioneering history. Significantly, this sense of pride was actively engineered into the museum from the outset, as it was explicitly designed to offer its audiences an exciting chapter in the history of Australia. It is unsurprising, but theoretically interesting, therefore, to see that the weight of those narratives of identity is felt and taken up by certain visitors at particular moments. The last extract points too to the ways in which a person's history, social position, and bodily memories are also simultaneously called upon to mediate their experience, in concert with those deliberate and consciously imparted interpretive messages. For some visitors, categories of self defined around notions of Australianness worked quite explicitly to subdue other categories, particularly those of difference, such as newcomers and other cultures. Implicit here is a feeling of belonging, or perhaps more accurately, the policing of a feeling of belonging. Interestingly, this policing seems to revolve in part around the intentionality of the Union Jack and the different affective and symbolic qualities it has come to embody. The same object is actualized in two very different ways, depending on its relations to each body and their histories and contexts. The latter extract also references Probyn's contagion of shame, which she argues works to expose any breaches in the border between self and other. The vulnerability of this breach was swiftly policed and minimized with reference to a crucial and positive value judgment regarding where we are today. While there are emotional registers, entanglements, and a sense of unease evident within the last two quotes, and a clear demarcation between self and other, that the speakers, perhaps unconsciously, were seeking to explain. These registers were replicated more explicitly in a conversation with a woman visiting the site for the first time with her daughter and grandson. And I'll let you read a snippet of that exchange. This particular visitor went on to reflect upon the great memories triggered by her visit, which stand in contrast to the way she perceives Australia today. It just takes you back and you think, oh my God, how complicated are our lives now and how simple were they back then? Interesting here is the absence of reflection on colonial and gendered resonances. Rather, the glossiness of the site itself remains intact if visitors only think within the boundaries of the dominant Anglo-Australian heterosexual male. This visitor was by no means alone in her observations of a feeling of exclusive belonging. Rather, I use her words because they offer such a sharp registering of the transition from constructions of the nation to constructions of the self. The final theme that I want to touch on here is critical ruptures of a transnational heritage and the emergence of ethical thinking, feeling subjects within the semiotic landscapes of Sovereign Hill. While for some visitors, reminders of immigration and multiculturalism felt like intrusions and uncomfortable presences, the same narratives for others prompted an openness to the possibilities of difference and a more inclusive framing of belonging. In other words, the museum's semiotic landscape was a changing constellation, triggering for some an ethical sensibility that arose out of a palpable absence, the absence of others. In an effort to promote a simple, legible narrative at Sovereign Hill, there has inevitably emerged the portrayal of only one kind of life, that of the white male settler. And in the spaces in between, the signs, actors, artifacts, and buildings that point towards that particular historical figure, a more troubling suite of questions about erasure gathers. Absences then were constructing the semiotic landscape as diligently and as carefully as presences. For a number of visitors encountered during my fieldwork, such questions pierced through the museum's exhibitions, prompting them to search for historical evidence, material traces, in-place stories, and the vestiges of lives associated with others, the Chinese, women, and indigenous people. Understood through a relational framing, this produces a very different museological space in which the landscape is haunted by absences of the dead and their memories. It gathers at the edges and becomes a node, in Gaston Gordillo's terms, out of which flow lingering threads of loss. Such a haunting has the capacity to turn an absence into a pressure on the body, a physical pressure that is felt and thereby affects, compelling, as the following extract illustrates, some visitors to imagine the situations and circumstances of others. In terms originally set out by Ahmed, it was emotions that moved them, as one particular visitor reflects in the following lengthy extract. It goes over 2 slides, so I'll just give you a moment to read the first slide. An empowered agent, this visitor actively engaged with an effective discursive practice that prompted her to lament the lack of feeling stirred by her visit. This extended extract hinges around a failure of the interpretive material to fully satisfy her interest, the type of interest, as Probin points out, that's hard to come by unless it's deep within your habitus. In other words, her sensitivity towards absences and silences may well be part of a wider political stance towards the world that animates her everyday life. Unlike in the previous section, this sort of utterance indicates what we might think of as a feeling of inclusive belonging or an inclination towards others, which was shared by others visiting Sovereign Hill. Here's a quote for you to cast your eyes over. As most of the quotes used to illustrate this section attest, a great deal of critical thinking about the consequences of exclusive belonging centered for these visitors on feelings of alienation and persecution, particularly in relation to Chinese miners. During the 1850s, for example, male Chinese miners made up almost 1/4 of the population, yet little is known about them in their own right, beyond that they were subjected to relentless persecution and acts of racism. As the layout of Sovereign Hill itself illustrates, Chinese miners were marginalised spatially and were often located at the bottom of the mining camps due to the low hygiene associated with the area, particularly the runoff of sewage. Visitors can get a brief sense of this at the Golden Point Chinese village, which consists of small, darkened tents and herbalist shops and a temple. On occasion, these more sanitised spaces are injected with signs of life in the form of audio recordings, which depict the thoughts of Chinese miners on everyday life, the English, the issue of tax, and the cramped living spaces, but these seemed only to operate on particular days, not every day. Despite the relatively slight intrusion of the voices of the other into the museum, some visitors were moved to reflect critically on inequalities. One of the key moments at Sovereign Hill, where resonations of the other are felt, occurred during a reenactment of an anti-immigration meeting performed in the Victoria Theatre on Main Street. The performance involved costume actors who work hard to recreate feelings of discrimination and persecution in everyday mining life, using a script that revolves around the central character of Ballarat's Chinese protectorate, appointed by colonial authorities, William Henry Forster. The language used in the performance is drawn from historical sources such as newspapers and carries a claim to authenticity. During the course of the performance, I observed some audience members leaving the theatre and others looking unsettled and confused, some nonplussed and others quite alarmed. It was a useful reminder that effects are not only a matter for the individual, but that any contact is shaped by histories of contact and mediated by bodily held memories. My responses were in many ways mediated by the emotional responses of those around me. This was a point in the fieldwork during which strong emotions palpably circulated, and in that short moment the weighted bodies of white miners lost prominence that was so evident in the rest of the museum complex, and gave room, however momentarily, to the bodies and histories of Chinese miners. For me, and perhaps for everyone else in that theatre, my own ethnic and national identity felt disturbingly and shamefully exposed. And those feelings stuck to my body as I exited the theatre and moved back onto Main Street. So I burst into Sovereign Hill on a Monday morning in March 2014. As I stood and got to grips with the scenes unfolding before me, I remember thinking about how I got into this area of research in the first place, my visits to Hiroshima and Auschwitz. I was also thinking about the intersections between past and present, and recalling Dennis Burns' insistence that heritage studies could and should do more to understand how past landscapes and objects conjure and mediate affect. My research in places like Pearl Harbor, Taunton, Kakadu and Sovereign Hill could contribute to such a debate by drawing attention to the cognitive, discursive and interpretive engagements within spaces of heritage. Indeed, over the course of a few years and hundreds of conversations with visitors to heritage sites, it has become clear that many visitors, such as those I've briefly introduced you to at Taunton and Sovereign Hill, use the past, however it is evoked, in ways that are deeply and theoretically engaging. Everyday practices of visiting often prompt people to reflect upon and respond to a range of contemporary social and political debates within the context of the historical. In other words, heritage facilitates an engagement with the present, which is clearly informed by messages about the past retrieved on site. In addition to acknowledging the vitality of encounters encompassed by the semiotic landscapes of heritage tourism, I've also tried to point to the importance of identity work. At both Taunton and Sovereign Hill, visitors sought to understand their own identities as visitors, as Australians, as Yorkshire folk, or as political beings, within the spatial and historical context offered by the museum and the battlefield, particularly in response to absence or presence of markers of identity within the landscape. I've also hinted at something of a deficit that exists in heritage research around understanding what actually happens in moments of encounter. To remedy this, I, along with my good colleague Steve Watson, have drawn inspiration from recent studies that have successfully shifted the sociological debate towards what might broadly be described as the more than representational. This, as the name more than implies, does not mean abandoning the visual or representational, as this remains a key source for accessing people's imaginations. Rather, we advocate a research style that seeks to access sensual, emotional, and reflexive embodied performances. To do this, we've tried to place greater emphasis upon the tactile, experiential, emotional, and sonic. These full-bodied experiences with heritage are not comprised entirely of intentionality or conscious and continuous deliberation. There are bodily interruptions at play too. There is thus a broader theoretical agenda to this presentation, one that connects with attempts to understand heritage as doing, heritage as performing, as framing, as producing, as acting. The turn to effect is thus driven by a harder theorization of the transpersonal, mobile and communicable, with effect envisioned as flowing from one body to another, responding individually and collectively to atmosphere, to mood, and so forth, and in a way that is directly relevant to heritage research. While social in origin, it is felt in so much as it literally gets into the individual, spreading like wildfire. Recovering affective energies requires the adoption of innovative styles of research that rewrite the method books and which are capable of accessing sensory experiences, recovering memories, and pinning these down. Inevitably, however, there is more to this than research. Whilst new styles, research styles, are essential to the exploration of new dimensions in the experience of heritage, We also have to consider how the field of heritage itself is likely to be modified or even expanded by the availability of such approaches. Changing the way that heritage is researched will have a reciprocal effect on its ontology. New heritages are likely to emerge. Heritage of attachment and affinity, of embodied experience and mobile effect. Heritages constituted in moments of encounter and engagement, registered in the body, on the surface of the skin, and expressed with and without thought. These are the new objects of heritage research, and giving shape to these styles and methods has been the purpose of this presentation. Thank you very much.
Do I dare say anything? This is when I told you it was going to be like an intricate tapestry. It was, and also soft but very hard subject now to get into. So much of this wonderful discourse. I'm still thinking about those things that we hear on TV. Tangible heritage, intangible heritage, a little dance company or weaving little things, but it's so deep now, and it goes into so many disciplines and thinkings. So I'll give you a second to just inhale, because this was intensive. Thank you so much for this elegant presentation. No, absolutely, on the contrary. And then I'll just open up for, I'm sure there are experts on heritage in the audience to engage with Emma and the rest of us here. So I will open the floor for discussions. Well, I can start maybe because, just to kill off the silence. We discussed this during lunch, these issues of, for example, which environmental psychology deals with, attachment to place, the sense of place, longing for belonging. And then, of course, they have their own way and set of doing research methodology or using research methodologies. Do you see connections with what you use in heritage and your novel approaches with something which maybe environmental psychologists do?
Yeah, for sure. But I would confess that I'm not too familiar with it. But one of the heritage is a super small field. But one of the most exciting things about the field is it has always poached from other disciplines, especially the more established disciplines. So we poach our theories from human geography, cultural geography, archaeology, anthropology, our methods from the same. And there is certainly some publications now emerging that are co-written between heritage researchers and social psychologists. I'm not as familiar with environmental psychology, but architecture, there'll be whenever I hear presentations, I'm like, we could use that. Heritage just has this very pleasing way of being able to, as we were saying at lunch, it touches on so many disciplines. I think that would be very exciting too.
That's what we were longing for, this, interdisciplinary, meaning maybe we should all get into heritage studies now and finally do it. Also issues of authenticity. This comes up now, these fake urban environments that we have. Our colleagues from urbanism tried even through a whole paradigm during 2 or 3 decades to recreate places where people would try to rebuild or feel a sense of belonging, community, and also build social capital. But I guess from heritage studies, as you see, it's much more complex when you look into it. What are the traces left? What of those traces can be used in something more tangible when it comes to recreating built environments? It was an interesting thing that you gave the 4 environments in the beginning, from Auschwitz to Pearl Harbor down to what was the third? Hill. That's right.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah, great.
From working with a site, how do you choose which exactly era or which heritage should be more explicitly preserved? Because especially when there is lots of eras and lots of history in this place, what is your approach when you choose which one to work with?
Well, if I'm understanding your, I wouldn't make those decisions. If I'm understanding your question, that's the job of curators.
Okay, so it's not.
It's not some. I'm one of those awful people that lets them do all the hard work, and then I swoop in and go, but what about these people? But in Australia, and there's certainly another person who would consider themselves Australian over there. One of the narratives that is often hidden, and certainly has been for a long time, at Sovereign Hill is indigenous histories, and as a curator, I do not think there could be any excuse for that happening anymore. And yet, I don't know if you would agree with me, Danielle, but that is a narrative that is constantly hidden. We should ask your question to them, but specifically ask them why that history continues to be hidden. It's such a strange thing in the Australian context.
And this does not serve any specific purpose to hide this narrative?
Well, no, I think it probably does serve a purpose. It's just not one that we would necessarily consider palatable. It's very political. There's a very... it's probably this... I'm less familiar with America and Canada and New Zealand, and there's probably similar things going on there. But in Australia, there's a real tussle. You will hear it on the news whenever Australia Day rolls round in January about who gets to claim Australia, and the indigenous presence poses an enormous problem for the pockets of Australia that want to claim it for themselves, and so it has become an issue that is exercising the nation at a very, very political level.
Just one last question about Melbourne. I know there is the new Apple store being built there.
Yeah.
How do you perceive this in relation to heritage and this kind of new intervention?
That's in Federation Square. Do you know much about it? I don't know much about it. You know much about it? I know a little bit. Yeah, tell us.
I'm from Melbourne.
Well, you would, yeah.
So I know a little bit about it, but I live here. So there are some correlations between. There's an Apple store, I don't know if you know, that was proposed here as well in Stockholm.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Because it's putting Apple Store on Federation Square that is the issue.
Yeah. So Federation Square is arguably Melbourne's city square. It's sort of a new square. It's about 20 years old. And Apple proposed a store there, which required the demolition of another building, and that building houses an Indigenous Heritage Trust as well. So they were tenants, and they're having to move out as a result of the Apple Store.
Yeah.
So it's currently under question and being debated as well right now. It's going through the planning system.
Yeah, some decision occurred a couple of days ago, but I don't know what that was. It flipped through my Twitter feed, but I didn't get a sense of what.
I think it was the plan around the planning decision.
Yeah. So it's ongoing right now. I thought I thought Apple lost. Maybe. We'll have to check when we leave.
But some cynics would say Federation Square is not Piazza Navona, right?
Look,
it's still a new place, sort of deconstructivist architecture, isn't it? A little bit of urbanism. So changes, and where are you allowed to change when heritage really becomes heritage?
Well, that's the other thing is there's for a long time they had an age. If it was 50 years old or more, it was heritage. That was heavily debated, and the idea that we could attach an age.
One more, and then you have a
I
gentleman
had a
there.
question sort of leading on from that.
Okay.
And my question was about the Hidden Histories exhibition that was held in 2015, and what was the response to that, and what's happened afterwards? Because you said that there isn't really.
I don't know, because I was there the year before. Yep. So my discussions with the visitors were before this was launched. It's still there. So it opened in 2015, and it's now part of the museum. But my understanding is so that there's the actual recreated streetscapes. And then there's a visitor centre that you buy your tickets in, and I believe it is in there. It's not laced through the site. It's segregated in a part of the site that not every visitor. They buy their tickets there, but they're not necessarily there. It's like a gift shop and things, so they're not necessarily there. So it's the same with the Chinese narratives. They're also segregated to just one element of the site, as if the Chinese presence wasn't felt throughout. I just noticed my microphone started working, so maybe it wasn't on for the rest of it.
That's good, right? The mic.
It's okay? Okay.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting, and I like the way where your research is going. I was thinking in your presentation, you were highlighting the importance of the history for the place and the heritage making. I was wondering, have you taken in the importance of nature and the being natural resources and being a landscape that is very identifiable and so on.
Especially at Taunton, which it is devoid of really any kind of material traces of the past, other than what are slowly revealed by the landscape over time. So I'm always very interested in taking a landscape approach to these to this sort of research. This field of heritage studies has a peculiar way of approaching landscape, in that there's this assumption that we have categories of heritage and we have cultural heritage, which is composed of tangible and intangible, and then we somehow have natural heritage, which is carved off and separate. And that's something that's existed in heritage studies, not so much in the literature we read. We've very much accepted that you can't separate the two, but in practice, definitely we still have a World Heritage Convention that separates the two, and that sort of still just has an effect, certainly makes it very difficult when you're conceiving of a project, how to bring everything in when you know that they're managed differently, understood, there's different policies for it, and so it sort of puts these artificial boundaries in that you've somehow got to negotiate. But I personally do subscribe to that sort of taking a landscape approach of these things. But whether my participants do or not, I
did you encounter anything of this in the interviews
in Taunton, yes. Sovereign Hill, no. I think they would have to have done some sort of degree to be willing to think about it in terms of that sort of marriage of nature culture. Whereas in Taunton, it is so obviously both a natural and cultural landscape. It was much more informing of people's responses to the site.
Thank you.
Hi, I'd like to know your thoughts about how much heritage should be preserved or adapted to suit modern day life. So, for example, UNESCO World Heritage Sites.
Yeah, now there's a question. No, well, UNESCO World Heritage Sites have become, how to say it? They have become problematic. They have for a long time been considered some sort of beauty contest almost, that countries vie to have the most. And certainly, so it was always dominated by Europe. The Europeans had a great claim to this competition of who would have the most heritage sites. But I think now it's a tie between China and Italy. Yeah? I think they might be on a tie now, no? Did China just not match them? Anyway, it's still this sort of great machine where particular countries are just rolling along, gathering them as quickly as they can, and I'm not sure what that's about, but the question of how much we should preserve is a really, really interesting one.
Because when I was in Granada, which is a World UNESCO Heritage Site, they were basically saying it shouldn't be because it's killing the city. Because it's killing the city. It's making it into a museum town.
Yeah.
Because they can't afford to refurbish it, and nobody can really live there anymore.
Yeah, for sure. So there's always these delicate balances. So it would be great. People love to live in heritage houses, but also you would never want to own a heritage house. You know, at the same time, you'd never want to own one because you couldn't change anything, or if you wanted to change things, it would cost you 4 times more than it would if it wasn't a heritage house. So there's this constant tension between, and it's what makes heritage studies so interesting. It's not something that I could answer.
Would you consult with the UN? What would your advice be to help them update their policy?
Gosh, I don't know. I actually honestly feel like the World Heritage Convention and that side is so far removed now from the sort of academic work that everybody's doing in the field that it's hard to even work out how you could rein it in. Although I think there is some fatigue in some countries now, some World Heritage fatigue, and certainly in places like, certainly World Heritage fatigue from people who live in those places, in places like Barcelona and Venice and where we live in the Blue Mountains, just absolutely over the over-tourism that comes with World Heritage branding. So it's probably a question that will be asked for, your question will be asked for a long time as politicians, heritage practitioners, heritage academics try to grapple with that fast-growing tension between how much we preserve. We've got plenty of arguments for why we preserve things, and now we have to grapple with the arguments about why we should let things decay, why it's okay. We've preserved. Maybe we're now at the point where it's okay to let things decay or adapt. Yeah.
A bit difficult to formulate the question, but I'll try. In popular culture, you have places in films and record sleeves people pilgrimage to.
Mm-hmm.
Could be a street or could be a certain place, and it creates a sort of a history, and people go there. And also you have places where events has happened, like in Paris with assassinations and things like that, and Texas, Dallas, people go there. And it creates a feeling or something like that. So people go there organically, but then you have governments or organizations of interest that tries to create monuments or places for a specific reason, and I find that mostly they fail miserably because there isn't anything there to begin with. They just put up something and they expect people to go there and moan, to be sad or happy or whatever, you know. What is it that they aren't really getting? Is it that you're just trying to construct something, or you get my question?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. It reminds me of a site in Spain. A small town found a what did they find? A burrow, you know, underground chamber. And they thought, we've got it made. We found this prehistoric chamber. Just make us some brochures, and that'll be that. But of course, it's far more complicated than just finding something, and suddenly people just don't suddenly just turn up, like you say. There's certain I don't know what they're missing. I think they think we'll make something. It works over here. It should work over here. We've got to make our place distinctive. We've got to, you know, make ourselves stand out within this landscape. But I think what they're missing is much of what I've been trying to talk about today is that people, you can cognitively know about a place, but to get people to go there outside of, you know, the really big tourist sites that just get people trafficking through because they're heavily branded, people have to feel for some reason to go there and to tell other people to go there. You know, you need to go there because when I went there, I felt this, whatever feeling, I feel like there has to be that sort of encounter that happens that changes a person, however slightly that may be, or however momentarily that may be.
We'll have in May one of Emma's colleagues, Karen Frank, will talk about monuments of remembrance. I think she wrote a book on that, sort of. What are the fake ones and what are the real ones?
Yeah, you can ask her that question, yeah.
She'll be there.
Yeah.
Okay, do we have any more? If not, then I think it's, I would just want to thank Emma, and this was wonderful. And I want to remind you all of this will be on, you can see it on YouTube if you want to catch more. We don't have a second part off the record, but you can see what you have seen now again, and there will be a book also produced with all our speakers somewhere at the end of the year by Bristol University Press. All the 20 Athenians will end up in a book, so we'll be able to also read these wonderful articles. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thank you all for coming, and we'll see you soon again. Oh yeah, and we have a little heritage gift for you.
Thank you very much. Thank
kind
you.
of a couple weeks old.
Ooh, that's very kind. Thank you.
many people are supervisors there? Was it you? There's two very good landscape people in the Department of Arts. One is more design oriented, one is more research oriented.
Lectures that